This is a story about id Software. Or ID, as anyone unaware of Freud's structural model of the psyche called them. Which, given Doom came out when the biggest intellectual challenge you had in a week was figuring out whether someone could win their challenge on You Bet, was, well, everybody. Doom was the point at which the PC started to be taken seriously as a gaming platform. Yes, it's been ported to everything since, including home pregnancy tests, but none of the contemporary console versions could match the speed and fluidity of Doom on a fast 486. And that's what counted. Even the PlayStation version only gets close, and it does so by removing detail and monsters from the levels. But PC players had already learned to expect something special from the Ides of March, as we didn't call them. But you know I can't resist a stupid running joke. Nearly 2 years earlier, in May 1992, the PC gaming world had been taken by storm by Wolfenstein 3D. Particularly because the game was shareware, a concept common in the PC world, where an entire episode of a game would be distributed via bulletin board and magazine cover disc, with a mail order address for those who wanted to continue playing. Not that we ever did. The addresses were in America, and so that was scary as well as expensive. The impressive thing about Wolfenstein is not only did it look like this, with VGA graphics and digitised sound, but it would run like this, even on a humble 286. And you might be thinking, really? Fully texture-mapped graphics on a computer that could barely shift flat-shaded polygons at a quarter of that speed? Yes, because it's not really drawing texture-mapped polygon graphics. It is, like me when I play a platform game, cheating like anything. I'm going to start by ruining Wolfenstein 3D for you. There is no floor and no ceiling. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Yes, they're just areas of flat colour, relying on detail sprites like lamps and puddles to make the endless grey void look a little more floor-like. And that's all the objects are, flat sprites which look the same from any angle. One advantage of the PC not having any hardware sprite support is it could scale them, just as easily as it could draw them, helping Wolfenstein achieve the 3D effect that's part of its name. But how about those walls? Wolfenstein 3D does something called raycasting. For each vertical line of the 320x200 screen, it sends out a single ray, slightly fewer than 320 of them, thanks to those horizontal borders around the viewport. Borders which you could make bigger if you had a slower PC, meaning fewer rays to calculate and fewer vertical strips to draw. As you might be able to see from this vintage map editor, levels in Wolfenstein 3D are built on a simple grid. This means each ray can be cast using a simple DDA algorithm, walking an entire block at a time. When the ray intersects a wall, the distance is used to give the height. And because a wall is always vertical, no clever perspective-correct texture mapping is needed. Wolfenstein 3D can use a faster method called affine texture mapping, where it scales the texture linearly according to the height of the wall. Internally, it dynamically compiles code to handle this scaling. While faster on 286 and 386 PCs, this is actually a slower approach on a 486 due to lack of effective cache use. However, if you have a 486, then you also have enough brute force to overcome this. And you're probably using it to play Doom instead. Providing there's not too much distance between you and the wall you're looking at, this raycasting approach runs very quickly. But it does benefit from levels being tight and claustrophobic. The further away a wall is, the more iterations each ray needs before intersecting something solid. You can see this easily if you create a level that's a huge empty room, and watch the frame rate dive along with the draw distance increasing. You might think this is impressive to come up with all in one game, and you'd be right. The founding members for id Software originally worked for a company called Softdisk. Softdisk had a bright idea. Computer magazines often came with a cover cassette or disc. But what if the disc was the magazine? One such magazette, as they called them, was Gamer's Edge, a regular delivery of new games for PC users. The staff read like a who's who of game development, including John Romero, John and Adrian Carmack, Lane Roth, and contributions from Tom Hall. Romero thought that a monthly schedule was too punishing for releasing high-quality games, so decided on a disc every 2 months. Which went well, but the group started to become frustrated by Softdisk's insistence on the discs being able to run on laughably puny hardware specs, including users still on original CGA cards. This came to a head when John Carmack tried to emulate the smooth scrolling of Nintendo's then current NES games, using a technique he called adaptive tile refresh. This used features of the EGA and greater graphics hardware to scroll the screen without needing to redraw all of it. Their demo, Dangerous Dave in Copyright Infringement, which used a bunch of Super Mario free graphics and level design, was impressive. But this first version wouldn't run on the CGA baseline Softdisk demanded. And while the team contacted Nintendo, the Big N weren't interested in having Mario on home computer platforms at the time. So instead, they formed Ideas from the Deep to develop their game further, and replaced those ripped Mario sprites with original IP. Commander Keen was published in 1990 by Apogee Software, and was one of the first big shareware success stories. Softdisk of course asked the inevitable question employers everywhere would ask at this point. Just how much of this was on company time, using company computers? Ideas from the Deep answered, quite a lot. After a bit of negotiation, not helped by some behaviour that was a bit too id and not enough superego, Softdisk and the nascent id Software came to an agreement. The team could exist as a separate company, but they would be contractually obliged to provide titles for the Gamer's Edge discs throughout 1991. This included Keen Dreams, a special episode of Commander Keen for Softdisk, rather than its normal publisher Apogee. Somehow they managed to get it running in CGA, although this was a special order disc. Most were EGA only. Softdisk's requirement to fit the entire game on a free 60KB magazette resulted in quite a bit of cut content, no matter whether you were playing with 4 or 16 colours. Being only midway through their exit contract, id started to experiment with new ideas. Or should that be ID, because at this point the team claimed it stood for in demand, rather than being a single word, or indeed anything to do with psychology. One such idea was an early version of that raycasting engine. This game, Hovertank 3D, is, engine-wise, most of what was needed for Wolfenstein 3D. This seems like an odd thing to say given how primitive it appears, but all of the mechanics of traversing a grid and working out what height walls should be are here. They get drawn as a solid line of colour, with a single black pixel at the top and bottom, but the position and size are just as they would be in Wolfenstein 3D. The core gameplay is here too. You traverse a maze, shoot some things, and collect some other things. In this case it's monsters and hostages, but here we have the dawn of the first-person shooter. You have a first-person view, and you shoot things. With the solid walls and EGA palette, it doesn't look too impressive. This is April 1991, and games like Indianapolis 500, The Simulation, had been providing convincing first-person 3D graphics at fluid frame rates 2 years earlier. But id were already thinking about those solid walls. What if instead of drawing a solid line, you drew a texture? This thought was sparked by a call with Paul Neurath at Blue Sky Productions, who were working on a first-person version of Ultima for Origin. Ultima Underworld would be released in 1992, using texture map polygons and being notorious for incredibly steep hardware requirements, demanding a fast 386, at a time when the standard gaming PC was still a 12MHz 286. John Carmack's response to this phone call was to say, "I could do that." Moreover, he did it on a game that runs smoothly on a 286, because raycasting doesn't need to do all of the complex transformation and perspective correction that a general-purpose polygon engine does. This game was Catacomb 3D, the last of id's 1991 titles for Softdisk, releasing in November of that year. still running in primitive 16-colour EGA, but also with ad-lib music and digitised sound. It may seem strange to give away something so technically impressive ahead of the company becoming fully independent, especially when many of the core elements of Wolfenstein 3D are here. The hand of the player character appearing on screen when firing, collecting keys, and prodding walls to find secret passages. But it knew that while it wouldn't be quite such a technical leap forward, converting the raycasting engine to use 256 colour VGA would be an enormous change in how gamers perceived it. The curse of the Catacomb games was that for all their technical sophistication, they looked embarrassingly dated in a PC world that was finally leaving EGA and CGA for dead. This was exactly what id had gambled on. That using VGA would make Wolfenstein 3D look a whole generation newer, despite being mostly the same engine underneath. Well aware that their contract with id was ending, Softdisk had brought on Mike Maynard and Jim Rowe to continue development, both on the Catacomb series and also on Dangerous Dave, John Romero's original series for Softdisk. Their first Catacomb follow-up was Catacomb Abyss. This one was released as shareware, and I remember playing it at the time. It was pitched as being more sophisticated than Wolfenstein, with more complex gameplay and varied environments. But even if this was true, with the game releasing after Wolfenstein 3D, it was hard to get past firing it up and seeing those EGA graphics. Next was Catacomb Armageddon, a mission pack sequel, and one that did not endear itself to me when I discovered the first level is an endlessly tedious key puzzle. Also, you remember me saying the raycasting engine is slow if you can see most of the way across a level? Armageddon does exactly this. It allows long view distances to open up as you solve more of that frustrating key puzzle, leading to choppy frame rates once you're close to finishing the opening level. Admittedly, at this point, id Software were just as guilty of the mission pack sequel, with their own game Spear of Destiny, but at least that played well, even if the difficulty was tuned a little to the hard side. Catacomb suffered one final sequel, Catacomb Apocalypse, but this is so more of the same. It even starts with the same tedious key puzzle as the previous game. And by the end of 1992, releasing a game with EGA graphics was an embarrassment. Not only was VGA completely the default by this point, we were only a year off seeing games with a base requirement of 640x480 SVGA. Mike Maynard and Jim Rowe left Softdisk to work on their own shareware title, Blake Stone Aliens of Gold, using an extended and enhanced Wolfenstein 3D engine that allowed for floor and ceiling textures and more interaction with the game world. Their departure ended both the Catacomb series and the Gamer's Edge discs themselves. Softdisk continued to publish games into the mid-90s, but moved to becoming an ISP and providing web hosting from 1995. So is Catacomb worth it in the present day? There's a nicely packaged omnibus on GOG for £4.50 at the time of writing. But if you want vintage early 90s FPS action, then a similar pack compiling all the Wolfenstein 3D episodes and Spear of Destiny is only £1 more. And those are vastly better games. Not just the technology, but the level design is better. And what Catacomb tries to pass off in its later iterations as more complex gameplay is just tedious and fiddly. I vastly prefer Wolfenstein 3D's more streamlined approach. If after watching this video, you feel the need to experience Catacomb 3D for yourself, then I'd suggest downloading the shareware episode of Catacomb Abyss, and only proceed if you really enjoyed having your eyeballs seared by that.